August 1943, a train packed with German prisoners of war crawls through the Louisiana countryside, and the men inside can barely process what they're seeing through the windows. Pine forests stretch endlessly, swamps shimmer in the brutal heat. These soldiers, most of them Afrika Korps veterans who'd been fighting in the Tunisian desert just months earlier, are drenched in sweat, their wool uniforms clinging to their skin. One prisoner later wrote in his diary that stepping off that train felt like walking into a furnace. This was Camp Claiborne, located near Alexandria, in central Louisiana, where approximately 3,000 German PSWs would spend the remainder of the war. During the Atlantic crossing, their officers had briefed them on what to expect. American captivity would be brutal, they'd been told. Nazi propaganda had spent years painting the United States as a mongrel nation controlled by Jewish bankers and Chicago gangsters, a place where prisoners could expect torture, starvation, maybe worse. The SS had circulated stories about Americans collecting gold teeth from pea corpses. These men, some barely 20 years old, others career Wehrmacht soldiers, marched through the camp gates expecting hell. What greeted them instead made no sense whatsoever. American guards who seemed almost relaxed, leaning against buildings and smoking cigarettes. Barracks that were basic but equipped with actual beds and mattresses, not concrete floors or straw. Mess halls where the portions exceeded what many of them had eaten during the final desperate months in North Africa. Joseph, a Bavarian corporal, remembered his first American meal decades later. Mashed potatoes, beef stew, white bread, real coffee, and a fresh apple. He'd nearly broken down by April 1943. Before Rommel's army collapsed in Tunisia, German rations had dwindled to hardtack and whatever tinned fish they could scrge. The real shock came within days. A U.S. Army lieutenant assembled a group of new arrivals to explain camp regulations. Through a translator, he covered the basics: roll call schedules, work assignments, restricted areas. Then he mentioned something that made the entire formation go silent: recreational privileges. On designated afternoons, prisoners would be permitted to use camp facilities. This included, the lieutenant said with no particular emphasis, supervised swimming in the local Rapids Parish waterways. The translator paused, certain he'd misunderstood. Swimming? The American nodded. Yes, swimming in the same rivers where civilian families cooled off on summer afternoons. A former school teacher from Hamburg later tried to describe the psychological vertigo of that moment. These men had surrendered, expecting death camps or slave labor, the kind of treatment Germany was inflicting on Soviet prisoners in the East. Instead, the Americans were offering them swimming privileges. It shattered everything they'd been taught about how enemies behaved in wartime. Some suspected a trap. Maybe the guards would shoot them in the water and claim an escape attempt. Others figured it was temporary, a show for Red Cross inspectors. Not one of them imagined the truth. This wasn't special treatment. This was simply American policy in action. The first time German prisoners actually walked down to the swimming area accompanied by a handful of bored-looking American guards, they kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. The Kazure River and various smaller waterways near the camps became regular recreation spots by late 1943 and into 1944. Guards would escort groups of 20 or 30 PSWs to designated swimming areas, typically in the late afternoon when the Louisiana heat became unbearable. The Americans carried rifles, sure, but they'd sling them over their shoulders and sit in the shade occasionally, glancing up from magazines or newspapers. The message was clear: don't try anything stupid and we won't have a problem. Then the local families started showing up. Mothers with children, teenagers, elderly couples. They'd arrive at the same river spots, lay out blankets, and wade into the water within shouting distance of enemy soldiers. The first few times this happened, the Germans froze, unsure how to react. Was this some kind of test? A few prisoners actually swam back toward their guards, worried they'd be accused of fraternizing or attempting to take hostages, but the guards just waved them off. Relax, one sergeant told them. It's a river, there's enough room for Everybody, what the PS couldn't wrap their heads around was the casual nature of it all: children splashing and laughing within 50 feet of Wehrmacht soldiers, fathers teaching their sons to swim while German prisoners floated on their backs nearby. One former POWs from Stuttgart recalled watching an American boy, couldn't have been more than 7, swim right up to him and ask in broken German if he was really from Germany. The kid wanted to know if Klaus had ever seen the Rye River. They had a 5-minute conversation about rivers before the boy's mother called him back. No panic, no screaming, just a curious kid and a homesick soldier talking about water. The swimming privilege wasn't universal at every camp, and it certainly wasn't advertised in U.S. newspapers. Americans back home might not have appreciated knowing that German PS were enjoying leisure time while their own sons bled in France, but in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and parts of Texas, this scene repeated itself throughout 1944 and into 1945. Camp guards had discovered that prisoners who got regular recreation time were far less likely to cause problems. Swimming exhausted them, improved morale, and created a routine that made camp management easier. It was practical, not idealistic, for the Germans. Though the experience was transformative, these weren't just swimming holes, they were daily proof that everything they'd been told about America was a lie. The propaganda had described a nation of weaklings and criminals, a society on the verge of collapse. Instead, they were seeing ordinary people living ordinary lives, treating captured enemy soldiers with a bizarre mixture of caution and basic human decency. Otto, a former tank commander, later said that those afternoons in the Louisiana rivers did more to deprogram him than any political lecture ever could. When a society lets its children swim alongside its enemies, he realized that society isn't afraid of those enemies anymore. The reason American P camps operated this way wasn't kindness or progressive politics. It was law. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and the Roosevelt administration decided to follow it to the letter. This wasn't just moral posturing. American officials knew that hundreds of thousands of U.S. servicemen were being held in German P camps, and strict adherence to Geneva rules gave the State Department leverage. If Germany mistreated American prisoners, the U.S. could credibly threaten reciprocal treatment. It was diplomatic insurance written in treaty language. The 1929 convention laid out specific requirements. Prisoners had to be housed in conditions similar to the capture nation's own troops. They had to receive adequate food. The treaty specified that rations should match the quantity and quality of what depot troops received. PS had to be paid for their labor, with rates varying by rank. Enlisted men earned 80 cents per day in script that could be spent at camp cantons. Officers couldn't be compelled to work at all, though many volunteered out of boredom. The treaty mandated recreational facilities, religious services, and the ability to send and receive mail. Even the swimming privileges, as bizarre as they seemed, fell under Article 17's requirement for physical exercise and sports. For German prisoners who'd been fed years of propaganda about American barbarism, this created massive cognitive dissonance. Heinrich, a former infantryman from Saxony, later described his first month at Camp Ruston in northern Louisiana as mentally destabilizing. He'd wake up, eat eggs and toast for breakfast, spend the morning doing light forestry work, return to camp for a hot lunch, and have his afternoons free for recreation. Meanwhile, he knew, because letters occasionally got through, that Soviet prisoners in German camps were dying by the thousands from starvation and exposure. The asymmetry was staggering. How could wars work like this? How could one side treat captives as protected persons while the other side worked them to death? The answer, American officers occasionally explained, was civilization, not in some triumphalist sense but as a practical matter. The U.S. viewed the Geneva Conventions as a mutual pact between developed nations. You protect our guys, we protect yours, and everybody's military benefits from knowing their soldiers won't be tortured. If captured, this created an incentive for surrender. By mid-1944, German soldiers on the Western Front were surrendering in massive numbers, partly because word had spread that American captivity was survivable, even comfortable. The policy was working exactly as intended. Camp cantons sold cigarettes, candy, toiletries, even musical instruments. PWS could buy American beer, real beer, not near beer, at 3 bottles per week. They formed orchestras, theater groups, soccer leagues. Camp Claiborne had a full prisoner-run newspaper. By 1944, the cognitive dissonance intensified. When prisoners realized they were living better in captivity than many American civilians during wartime rationing. 1. P sent a letter home carefully monitored by censors describing his diet. His family in bombed-out Hamburg was surviving on turnips and black bread. He was eating pork chops and ice cream. The war, he wrote, made no sense anymore when seen from inside an American P camp. By 1944, labor camps were sprouting across the American South like mushrooms after rain, and German PWs became the backbone of the region's economy. The main camps, places like Claiborne, Ruston, and Livingston, operated as hubs, but the real work happened at hundreds of smaller branch camps scattered across Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas. These branch camps might house 50 to 200 men, stationed directly on plantations in national forests or near processing facilities. The labor shortage was desperate. American farm workers had either enlisted or migrated to higher-paying factory jobs in the North. Cotton needed picking, sugar cane needed cutting, timber needed harvesting, and crawfish needed processing. Enter approximately 50,000 German PSWs across the southern states, men who suddenly found themselves integral to the regional economy. The Geneva Convention specified that PSWs could be required to work, but not in war industries or dangerous conditions. Agriculture was explicitly permitted, so German soldiers who'd been firing 80mm guns at Allied tanks 6 months earlier were now driving tractors through Louisiana cotton fields. Former U-boat mechanics were operating sawmills. Luftwaffe ground crew were picking sweet potatoes. They earned their 80 cents per day in camp script, and farmers paid the U.S. government the standard agricultural wage for their labor, usually around 50 cents per hour. In 1944, the government pocketed the difference. What nobody anticipated was how thoroughly this arrangement would break down the psychological barriers between captors and captives. P.S. Working on family farms weren't abstract enemies anymore. They were Fritz and Hans and Verrer, the guys who helped Old Man Johnson fix his broken irrigation pump. Last Tuesday, farmers' wives would send lunch out to the fields, and the German boys would eat alongside the handful of American guards and whatever local workers remained. Language barriers created comic frustration at first, but by late 1944 many PSWs had picked up functional English, and some rural Southerners had absorbed enough German to communicate basic instructions. Economic dependency ran deeper than most Americans realized. Louisiana's 1944 sugar's harvest would have rotted in the fields without P labor. The timber industry in East Texas relied almost entirely on German work crews. 1 Louisiana farmer told a reporter off the record, because it sounded unpatriotic, that his German workers were more reliable than the local help had ever been. They showed up on time, followed instructions, didn't complain. These were, after all, military men accustomed to discipline and hard work. The irony was lost on nobody. America was fighting Germany in Europe while simultaneously depending on German soldiers to keep its southern economy functioning. This economic integration accelerated the humanization process. When your livelihood depends on someone's labor, you stop seeing them as a faceless enemy. Farmers would drive PS into town for supplies, trusting them not to run. Where would they go? A blind-haired German speaker in rural Louisiana would be spotted immediately, and most prisoners had figured out by this point that they had it pretty good. Escape attempts were rare, fewer than 2,000 out Of roughly 400,000 German PSWs held nationwide ever tried, and most were recaptured within days. Why flee a situation where you're well fed? Relatively free and safe from Allied bombs, some PS later admitted they'd felt guilty. Their comrades were dying in Normandy while they were swimming in Louisiana rivers and earning pocket money picking cotton. The cultural exchange that emerged in these Louisiana camps went far beyond work relationships. German prisoners weren't just economic assets, they became part of the social fabric in ways that would have been unthinkable anywhere else in the warring world. Church services became the first bridge. Many PSWs were Catholic or Lutheran, and Southern communities were deeply religious. By late 1943, camp commanders were allowing prisoners to attend local church services under guard supervision. St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Alexandria regularly hosted German PSWs at Sunday Mass, where they'd sit in designated pews while armed guards stood at the back. The chaplain would give his homily in English, then a German-speaking prisoner would quietly translate for his comrades. After services, church ladies would invite the guards and their prisoners to potluck lunches in the parish hall. These interactions revealed something the propaganda mills on both sides had tried to obscure: people are just people. Margaret, a Louisiana school teacher whose husband was serving in the Pacific, befriended several German PS who worked at a nearby forestry camp. They'd been professional musicians in civilian life, and she arranged for them to give a concert at the local high school in spring 1944. The program included Beethoven, Schubert, and Bach. The auditorium was packed. American families sat listening to enemy soldiers play German classical music, and when the final notes faded, everyone applauded. One prisoner, a violinist from Munich, had tears streaming down his face. He later told Margaret it was the first time in 3 years he'd felt like a human being instead of a soldier or a prisoner. Craft skills became another exchange currency. Germans taught wood carving to local teenagers. A former glass blower from Bavaria spent his free time creating intricate glass figurines that he'd trade for cigarettes or extra food. PS built furniture for local families, repaired watches, even helped construct a playground in one small town. The economic transactions were technically prohibited. PWS weren't supposed to engage in private commerce, but guards looked the other way. Everyone benefited. A German carpenter might build a hope chest for a farmer's daughter in exchange for homemade peon pie and real coffee. These weren't legal exchanges, they were human ones. Language lessons happened organically. American guards teaching English to bored prisoners during long shifts. PWS teaching German to curious local kids who'd show up at the fence lines. One camp in Nashio developed an informal language exchange program where prisoners and guards would spend evening hours tutoring each other. Some guards were taking these lessons seriously. They figured if they got shipped to Europe, knowing German might save their lives. The prisoners, meanwhile, were absorbing American idioms and slang, learning to distinguish between Louisiana draws and Texas twangs, picking up jazz vocabulary and baseball terminology. The most profound exchanges were the quiet ones: a German medic helping a local doctor during a medical emergency when the camp physician was unavailable. A former engineer sketching out irrigation improvements for a struggling farmer. A teenager from Hamburg teaching a Louisiana kid how to make proper German potato pancakes using sweet potatoes, since regular potatoes were hard to come by. These moments didn't make headlines or official reports, but they accumulated like interest in a bank account. Every interaction deposited a small amount of shared humanity, and by 1945 the balance was substantial. Some locals started seeing their German laborers less as enemies and more as victims of the same war that was killing their own sons overseas. It was cognitively complicated, morally messy, and utterly human. While German PSWs were swimming in Louisiana rivers and attending church potlucks, a very different reality was unfolding thousands of miles away. The contrast Between American treatment of German prisoners and what was happening on the Eastern Front wasn't just stark, it was almost incomprehensible. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, nearly 3.3 million died in captivity. That's a mortality rate of roughly 58%. They died from starvation, exposure, disease, execution, and systematic neglect. The Nazi regime viewed Slavic peoples as intervention subhumans and treated Soviet POWs accordingly. They were left in open-air pens without shelter, fed starvation rations if fed at all, and worked to death in conditions that made slavery look merciful. The Soviets returned the favor with interest. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Red Army, roughly 1 million never came home. The mortality rate was around 35%, better than what Germans inflicted on Soviets but still catastrophic. German POWs in Soviet camps faced forced labor in Siberian mines, inadequate food, brutal cold, and a general attitude of vengeful indifference. The Soviet Union hadn't signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, so Stalin felt no obligation to follow its rules. The Eastern Front was a war of annihilation where the concept of protected prisoners barely existed. German soldiers arriving in American camps carried this context in their heads. Many had served in the East before being transferred to North Africa or Italy. They'd seen how their own army treated Soviet prisoners. They'd heard stories and in some cases participated in the systematic brutality. When these men experienced American treatment, the psychological impact was seismic. Kurt, a former sergeant who'd fought at Stalingrad before being shipped to Tunisia, later described it as living in two different universes simultaneously. He'd watched Soviet POWs starve to death in makeshift camps near the Volga River in 1942. 18 months later, he was eating 3 meals a day in Louisiana and getting paid to chop wood. The asymmetry extended beyond just survival. American camps had infirmaries with actual medical care. German military doctors themselves, PSWs, treated their fellow prisoners using American-supplied medicines and equipment. Sick prisoners recovered instead of being left to die. When a measles outbreak hit Camp Claiborne in early 1944, American medical staff quarantined the affected barracks and provided the same treatment they'd give their own soldiers. Every single prisoner recovered. Meanwhile, typhus and dysentery were killing thousands. Camps across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The Germans held in America couldn't reconcile these realities. War wasn't supposed to have this kind of variance in human decency. Some POWs experienced survivors' guilt once they understood the full picture. They were safe, well-fed, and relatively free, while their former comrades were being ground into paste on the Eastern Front or dying by inches in Soviet labor camps. Letters from home when they got through described conditions in Germany itself. Allied bombing raids turning cities into rubble. Civilian starvation. The advancing Red Army's reputation for vengeance. One prisoner at Camp Livingston wrote in his journal that he felt like a moral coward for being grateful he'd been captured by Americans instead of Soviets. He was alive and comfortable. While Germany burned, the guilt was crushing, but so was the relief. American officers occasionally used these contrasts in re-education efforts. They'd show German PS photographs from liberated Soviet P camps, images of mass graves, skeletal survivors, evidence of systematic murder. The message was implicit: this is what your government did, this is what we didn't do to you. Some prisoners refused to believe the photographs were real, convinced they were propaganda. Others had the scales fall from their eyes immediately. The cognitive dissonance finally resolved into clarity. They'd been serving a regime that treated human beings as disposable while being held by a nation that followed actual rules. That realization didn't make the war's outcome less bitter for true believers, but it planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the years ahead. When the war ended in May 1945, the swimming stopped. But the story didn't. German POWs remained in American camps for months or even years after VE Day. The repatriation process was slow, complicated by logistics, politics, and the chaotic state of occupied Germany. Many prisoners weren't sent home until 1946, and some remained in American custody until early 1947. During this extended limbo, the relationships that had formed in places like Louisiana deepened. POWs who'd worked on the same farms for 2 years weren't strangers anymore. They were known quantities. Some had become genuine friends with local families, writing letters, sharing meals, becoming part of the landscape. Then something remarkable happened. They started coming back not as prisoners but as immigrants. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, former German POWs began returning to the American South, particularly Louisiana. The exact numbers are difficult to pin down. Immigration records didn't specifically track former POWs, but estimates suggest several thousand returned permanently. Some married local women they'd met during captivity. Others simply remembered Louisiana as a place where they'd been treated decently and saw opportunity in post-war America that didn't exist in devastated Germany. Herman, who'd worked on a sugar-cane plantation near Lafayette, returned in 1948 with his new bride from Hamburg. He bought land from his former employer and became a successful farmer himself. The swimming holes became memory landmarks. Former POWs returning as immigrants would take their new American families to the same river spots where they'd splashed around under guard years earlier. They'd point out the bend in the Calcasieu where they'd first realized American guards weren't going to shoot them. They'd describe the cognitive shock of watching American children play within arm's reach of enemy soldiers. These stories became family lore passed down through generations. The grandchildren of German PS and Louisiana locals swim in the same rivers today, often unaware of the strange history those waters hold. The returnees brought skills and perspective that enriched their adopted communities. German engineering precision applied to Southern agriculture, European craft traditions merged with American practicality. A former Luftwaffe mechanic opened an auto repair shop in Shreveport and became known as the best transmission specialist in 3 parishes. A Bavarian baker started a bakery in New Orleans that's still operating under his family's name. These weren't dramatic success stories, no rags to riches tales, just quiet integration into the American fabric by men who'd once been sworn enemies. What drove them back wasn't just economic opportunity, it was the memory of being treated like humans when they'd expected to be treated like vermin. Yon, who returned to Monroe, Louisiana in 1951, explained it to a local reporter decades later. In Germany, I was just another soldier. In Soviet camps, I would have been just another corpse. In Louisiana, even as a prisoner, I was Johann. People knew my name. That stays with you. The swimming privileges, the church services, the casual interactions, they demonstrated something that propaganda couldn't erase. America's strength wasn't its weapons or its industry. It was its willingness to extend basic decency even to enemies. The returning PS also served as living counterarguments to Cold War narratives. During the 1950s, as anti-German sentiment faded and anti-Soviet sentiment intensified, these men could testify from personal experience about the difference between American and Soviet treatment of prisoners. They'd lived through the comparison. Some became naturalized citizens and vocal cold warriors, their personal histories serving as propaganda for the American system. Others stayed quieter, content to farm their land, run their businesses, and raise their American children. Either way, their very presence in Louisiana communities was evidence that the swimming hole policy had worked. America had turned enemies into neighbors. The Louisiana swimming holes disappeared from American memory almost as soon as the last PS shipped home. No monuments were erected, no history books dedicated chapters to German prisoners learning to trust American guards while splashing in southern rivers. The story survived mainly in family albums and fatting letters in the memories of aging veterans and their children. It became One of those footnotes that historians occasionally mention in passing but rarely explore in depth. Yet this forgotten episode contains lessons that remain urgent decades later, especially in an era when the treatment of prisoners and enemies once again dominates political debates. The power of the swimming hole story lies in what it reveals about propaganda's limitations. The Nazi regime spent years conditioning German soldiers to view Americans as mongrel degenerates, as a weak nation incapable of real warfare, as a society that would torture and murder prisoners. Every piece of that narrative collapsed the moment PSWs experienced actual American treatment. No amount of ideological conditioning could survive the cognitive dissonance of being paid to work, fed proper meals, and allowed to swim alongside civilian children. Totalitarian propaganda depends on controlling information, but it cannot survive extended contact with contradictory reality. Those river encounters did more to deprogram Nazi indoctrination than any re-education lecture ever could. The Geneva Convention framework proved its value. Unexpected ways. American adherence to the 1929 rules wasn't about moral superiority, it was strategic calculation combined with legal obligation, but the effect was transformative anyway. By treating German PSWs according to international law, the United States created conditions where captured soldiers could recognize they'd been lied to about who the real enemy was. This wasn't accidental. The architects of American POWs understood that decent treatment would undermine enemy morale, encourage surrenders, and create a post-war population of Germans who'd experienced American democracy firsthand. The swimming privileges were part of this larger strategic vision, even if individual guards just thought they were managing bored prisoners on hot afternoons. The contrast with contemporary detention debates is uncomfortable. The United States in the 21st century has struggled with questions about prisoner treatment in ways that would have baffled the 1940s architects of policy. Enhanced interrogation techniques, indefinite detention, black site prisons, these represent departures from the Geneva framework that governed World War II camps. The swimming hole era demonstrates what's lost when nations abandon international legal standards for expedience or security concerns. German PSWs who swam in Louisiana rivers went home as witnesses to American decency. Prisoners subjected to harsh treatment become witnesses to American hypocrisy, and their testimony undermines soft power for generations. The economics of integration matter too. German PSWs became valuable to Southern communities because they were needed, and that need created relationships that transcended national enmity. Labor created proximity, proximity created familiarity, and familiarity made it harder to maintain hatred. This pattern repeats throughout history. Economic interdependence rarely guarantees peace, but it creates stakeholders in continued cooperation. The farmers who depended on German labor had personal incentives to treat them decently. The PSWs who earned wages and respect had incentives not to cause trouble. Self-interest aligned with humanity, and everyone benefited. The swimming holes are gone now, filled in or altered by decades of development and environmental change. The camps were dismantled in 1946 and 1947. Their barracks sold for scrap or repurposed. Most Americans under 60 have never heard this story, but the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of both guards and prisoners still live in Louisiana. Their family trees intertwined in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1943. The rivers still flow, families still swim,